America is no stranger to massacres. In fact, this country has subjected numerous groups of people to violence. Today, I want to talk about a massacre that happened in 1887. This massacre in particular is really important to me because I am a descendant of one of its victims. I want to share with you a story about my great-great-great-grandfather, Jack Conrad. He was a former Union soldier who was born a slave, and even as a free man, he was a victim and one of the only survivors of a racist mass shooting known as the Thibodaux Massacre. Years after slavery was abolished in the United States, black sugarcane workers in Louisiana still lived lives that were barely distinguishable from slavery. They were not allowed to own or rent land and had to live in old slave cabins. They were paid poverty wages of 91 cents per hour for a 12-hour shift, adjusted for inflation, and instead of cash, they received scrip or credit to use in the local stores. So they were basically paid nothing. As a result of these conditions, black sugarcane workers unionized and called a strike, demanding living wages and the right to rent land. Angered by their audacity to demand equal rights, white vigilante groups formed together to impose mass violence on these black sugarcane workers. On November 23, 1887, white vigilante groups started attacking black laborers and their families in Thibodaux, Louisiana. They went house to house, forcing unarmed black people to come out of their houses and shooting them dead. Every single victim in this massacre was black and included elders, women, and children. Jack Conrad was one of the only survivors. He was shot not once, not twice, not thrice, but 4 times. After he was shot, he crawled underneath a house and pretended to be dead, as white men continued throughout the neighborhood killing unarmed black people and their families, just because they demanded to be paid living wages. The massacre continued for about 2 hours, and it was around that time that someone pulled Jack from under the house and took him to a doctor. He miraculously lived to tell the story. Now, you may be wondering who these perpetrators were. Some of these perpetrators were from very distinguished families. Some of their descendants, to this day, hold positions of power. Jack Conrad even identified one of the perpetrators as his employer. History was rewritten, records disappeared, and not a single person was held accountable for the horrific violence they imposed that day. Both of Jack's sons were also shot, but they didn't make it. Mary Conrad, Jack's only remaining child, managed to survive. She ended up marrying a man named Jesse Jackson, and they are the reason why I'm alive today. Other victims of the massacre weren't so lucky. Entire families and bloodlines were ended that day. It wasn't until 77 years later that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed. During those 77 years, black people were still subjected to mass violence just like this. Records of some of these massacres were destroyed, so no one even knows anything about them. My grandparents, who are still alive, lived through Jim Crow. My grandfather fought in the Korean War, then came back home and still wasn't allowed to use the same water fountain as white people. My dad went to high school in the 1970s, and he can recall a story of one of his white classmates coming up to him and saying, "Never want a watermelon?" We found this white classmate on Facebook. He holds a very distinguished position at a company. He has children. He looks like a regular businessman, but I doubt that anyone knows that he said this to a black person in the 70s. Or maybe they do know about his ideologies and they agree with him. These people are still alive. These ideologies are still alive. Victims and perpetrators are still alive. I believe that knowing one's history gives one a greater sense of self. When we learn about our history, whether good or bad, we can move forward to dismantle harmful systems and beliefs. This is no history, no self. So we didn't know about this our whole lives, and there was a historian that actually wrote a book about it. And one of the sources that he found was my great-great-great-grandfather's diary. Yeah, so that's like where he got that. And then he got in contact with my family, and that's how we found out about it. We literally didn't know.
Your family didn't.
Yeah.